got a killer on a run in Ohio.
Hello, I'm Bill Swafford, and this is Murderers in Ohio. If someone told you that they were a prophet of God, would you believe them? Would you hand over your money, your car, your home over to this self-proclaimed prophet of God? Would you help this prophet of God commit murder? In 1989, followers of a man named Jeffrey Lundgren would do just that. Religious cults could show up anywhere. Would you know if one would show up next door to where you live? In January of 1990, law enforcement would go out to a farmhouse outside of Kirtland, Ohio. There they would dig up a hole and find 5 members of the Avery family: Dennis Avery, Cheryl Avery, and their 3 young daughters, 15-year-old Trina, 13-year-old Rebecca, and 7-year-old Karen. The farmhouse was rented by a man named Jeffrey Lundgren. Jeffrey lived there with his family and his followers. Soon it would be all over the news that 5 members of one family were murdered, and that family were members of a religious cult led by Jeffrey Lundgren, and that Jeffrey and his other followers murdered the Avery family. There was nothing really all that special about Jeffrey. If you would see him walking down the street, you would never thought, that's a man of God. Jeffrey was actually born in Independence, Missouri. There he grew up and eventually met his wife, Alice. There they had 4 kids. They had one son, which is very important to this case. His name was Damon. So I asked myself, why would people want to follow Jeffrey? And it's not always about looks. You just need the gift of talking. And you need people who are desperately looking for faith and God, looking for someone to lead them in the right direction. Jeffrey was brought up in church. He attended the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or they call themselves RLDS Church. At some point, Jeffrey would start to develop his own interpretation of the Bible. And at some point, he thought that God was talking to him through the Bible. In the summer of the year 1984, Jeffrey and his family moved to Kirtland, Ohio. There they found a house that was actually owned by the RLDS Church, and they lived there for free because Jeffrey worked as a tour guide for the Kirtland Temple. The Kirtland Temple is actually a historical landmark for their religion. Now, I do want to say for people who don't know, Kirtland, Ohio is in Lake County, which is in the northeastern part of Ohio, just east of Cleveland, Ohio. As I said, Jeffrey would volunteer as a tour guide for the temple, which was perfect for him. He started to preach his teachings at the temple, and he would soon even hold his Sunday school classes at the temple. He would sort of be recognized as a preacher or minister there amongst the church. Now, I believe that if no one would have believed what Jeffrey was preaching, Jeffrey would not have been able to do what he done. He would not have had anyone to back him up or to build him up. But Jeffrey started to get people who believed what he was preaching. He got followers. And why his family was living in this house owned by the church for free, some of Jeffrey's followers moved into that house. So a small cult was already starting to form under the disguise of a church group. Now, Jeffrey had a good setup working at the temple, doing his preaching, teaching his classes. However, all that ended. Jeffrey would get evicted from the house that the church owned. He would lose his voluntary job at the temple. And the reason why he lost that job was because Jeffrey was supposed to hand over some money or something from the visitors or something to hand that money over to the church. And he never did. So he was withholding money from the church. So they had to leave. So Jeffrey, his wife, his kids, and his followers were evicted. Jeffrey would soon rent a farmhouse outside of Kirtland, Ohio. It was a white two-story farmhouse with a red barn on the property. Jeffrey, his family, and some of his followers lived at the house. Some of his followers who lived with Jeffrey did give up their paychecks. They did give up the personal property, and some of them even called him Dad. Jeffrey might not be able to preach at the temple anymore, but he started to teach his Sunday school classes there at the farmhouse. In 1987, the Avery family decided they wanted to follow Jeffrey Lundgren, and they moved to Kirtland, Ohio from Missouri. Dennis Avery was an older looking man. He's probably the oldest one of Jeffrey's followers. His wife Cheryl had short brown hair. Their 15-year-old daughter Trina had long black hair. And their two younger daughters had reddish brown hair, which was short. In the year of 1988, Jeffrey had his followers, their money, their belongings. However, he would no longer have the church. The church decided they wanted nothing more to do with Jeffrey Lundgren. They would no longer recognize him as a preacher or minister of their church. Jeffrey was not happy about this. Jeffrey could not accept no longer being accepted at the temple. It is said in 1989 that Jeffrey started preaching to his followers about a wilderness trip. Jeffrey wanted everyone to go into the wilderness for a religious experience. Some of Jeffrey's followers left their jobs that they were working and even bought things for the trip. In April of 1989, it looked as though they were all going on a wilderness trip. The Avery family even packed up everything that they owned. However, the Avery family did not know what Jeffrey was planning. On April 12th of 1989, Jeffrey had a couple of his followers start digging a hole out in a big red barn on their property. They were not to tell anyone, though I suspect all the followers knew this was a plan that went on for a while. One night, Jeffrey went to Cheryl Avery and had Cheryl write a letter to her extended family, telling her extended family that her husband, and three daughters were going to Wyoming and that she would write them after they had gotten settled in. Everything seemed to be going as planned, so Jeffrey invited the family, the Avery family, over for dinner at the farmhouse with him, his family, and followers on April 17th of 1989. The Avery family thought that they were going to have dinner with someone that they could trust, someone that they thought was a self-proclaimed prophet of God. On April 17th of 1989, the Avery family did go out to the farmhouse outside of Kirtland, Ohio. They did have dinner with Jeffrey and his family and the rest of his followers. Cheryl Avery and her young daughter, help cook and do some of the cleaning. Some of Jeffrey's followers who were out there were Ron Luff and his wife Susan, Richard Brand, George Winship, Daniel Kraft, and a few others. Plus Jeffrey's wife Alice and his son Damon. After the dinner was over, Jeffrey, his son, and four of his followers, Ron, Richard, Daniel, and George, all went out to the barn. As if Jeffrey needed to give one last pep talk to his followers. Jeffrey would send Ron Luff inside to retrieve Dennis Avery. When they brought Dennis Avery out to the barn, that is when Ron Luff tried to stun Dennis Avery with a stun gun, but it failed. So they knocked him to the ground. They duct taped his ankles, wrist, and mouth. Then they drug Dennis Avery over to where Jeffrey Lundgren was standing. And that is when Jeffrey shot Dennis Avery. Jeffrey's followers then took Dennis Avery's body and threw it into the pit that they had dug in the barn. While all this was going on, someone had started up a chainsaw, and they ran that chainsaw. That way no one in the house could hear what was happening to Dennis Avery. The rest of the Avery family were still in the house, and Jeffrey did not want them to be scared and know what was going on. Jeffrey would then send Ron Love back into the house to retrieve Cheryl Avery. And when Cheryl Avery was back into the barn, she was duct taped and dragged in front of Jeffrey, just like her husband, Dennis Avery. Jeffrey then shot her as well, and they threw her body into the pit. This self-proclaimed prophet of God would not stop there. He would truly show that he was pure evil. Jeffrey Lundgren would send Ron Luff back into the house and bring out the young girls one by one, ages 15, 13, and 7. And those young girls were duct taped and laid in front of Jeffrey, where Jeffrey shot each one of those young girls just like their parents. And Jeffrey's followers threw those young girls' bodies into that pit with their parents. Jeffrey and his followers and son filled that pit back up with rocks and dirt. And then they all went back inside of the farmhouse. Shortly after going back inside of the farmhouse, Jeffrey sat down and decided he wanted to have a prayer meeting. Now, how do you have a prayer meeting with someone who just murdered a family of 5, especially 3 young girls? Jeffrey claimed that God told him to kill the Averys through the scriptures. Jeffrey believed that the Averys were the weak link amongst his followers. I believe that Jeffrey's followers only encouraged Jeffrey to take his preaching, his teachings, to a whole new level. The next day after the murders, April 18th, law enforcement come knocking on the door of the farmhouse. Police officers and the FBI were there to question Jeffrey and his followers. However, they weren't there about the Averys. They wanted to know about a planned attack on the Kirtland temple. Law enforcement interviewed everyone there at the farmhouse. Everyone said that they were there on their own free will and that they knew nothing about a planned assault on the temple. Law enforcement left the farmhouse that day without making any arrest. Law enforcement did not know that the Avery family were just buried out in that barn the day before. Law enforcement did not know that they just had talked to a murderer and the people that had helped him carry it out. Jeffrey and his followers and his family would leave the farmhouse. They would go to the mountains of Davis, West Virginia. There they would camp out in tents wherever Jeffrey would move them, and they would do this throughout the months up until October of 1989. Now, while they were in the hills of West Virginia, the gun that Jeffrey had used to shoot the Avery family, it is said that Jeffrey sold that gun while they were there in West Virginia. Now, something else happened in West Virginia that started to create bad feelings amongst the followers towards Jeffrey. Jeffrey decided that he wanted to take on a second wife. Jeffrey's first pick was a lady by the name of Tanya Patrick. However, that did not work out. And here's the thing about Tanya, she was married. Jeffrey's second pick for a second wife was also married. The lady's name was Catherine Johnson. Catherine was married to a man by the name of Larry Johnson, and he did not agree to this. Even if Catherine did agree, Larry was not going for it. Now, eventually, Jeffrey and some of his followers left West Virginia and moved to Missouri. Some of his followers, though, stayed back in West Virginia. Larry Johnson was not going to sit back and just let Jeffrey take his wife. 8 months after the Avery family were murdered in December of 1989, Larry went to law enforcement, and Larry told everything about how Jeffrey and his followers murdered the Avery family. On June 3rd of 1990, law enforcement would go out to the farmhouse and start digging up the hole in the barn. And they first discovered the body of Dennis Avery. The following day, they found the bodies of Cheryl Avery, Rebecca Avery, Trina Avery, and Karen Avery. A coroner's report would reveal that all the families had been duct taped, hands, wrists, and some of their eyes. Dennis Avery was shot twice in the back. Cheryl Avery was shot 3 times in the torso. 15-year-old Trina was shot in the head and twice in the body. 13-year-old Rebecca was shot in the back and in the thigh. 7-year-old Karen was shot once in the head and once in the chest. How can a self-proclaimed prophet of God murder a family of 5? Especially 3 young girls. Law enforcement's next move would be to hunt down Jeffrey Lundgren, his family, and his followers. Law enforcement would not find Jeffrey in Missouri. They actually arrested Jeffrey in California on January 7th of 1990. In an interview that Jeffrey had given to law enforcement, he stated that he never wanted the Avery family to move to Kirtland from Missouri. He even wrote the Avery family telling them not to make the move. However, the Avery family did anyways, and once they got to Kirtland, Ohio, Jeffrey made them give up everything, their car, their money. Jeffrey maxed out Dennis Avery's credit card. And Jeffrey actually planned on killing the Averys for at least 2 years. Jeffrey and his followers used the Avery family for everything that they could, and when they had nothing left and nothing left to offer, Jeffrey and his followers murdered the Avery family. Jeffrey's main message was that he and his followers needed to recapture the Kirtland Temple. And once they took over the temple again, that is when Jesus Christ would come back to earth. However, Jeffrey and his followers would never get that chance. Jeffrey Lundgren was found guilty of 5 counts of aggravated murder and kidnapping and some other charges. He was sentenced to die by the state of Ohio. Jeffrey wasn't the only one that would go to jail for this. There was 13 other people arrested and stood trial for this. Alice, Jeffrey's wife, Damon, Jeffrey's son, They both got life in prison for their parts. Ron Love, the man who led each one of the Averys to their deaths, received 170 years in prison. Now there was a few others, like Richard Brand, Daniel Kraft, George Winship, Susan Love, Katherine Johnson. They all would serve their day in court. Katherine Johnson only got obstruction of justice, only served a year. George Winship, Susan Love, Richard Brand, and Daniel Kraft, they all got 15 to 25 years in prison. Now, this is the year 2022, so it's been 32 years ago. 5 of these people have already been paroled from prison, which is Brand, Daniel Kraft, George Winship, and Susan Love. They're all out. Katherine Johnson only had to serve a year in prison. Now get this about Katherine. Katherine was the one who Jeffrey chose to be his second wife. Her husband is the one that turned the whole cult in. In an interview that Jeffrey had given to a prosecutor during a clemency hearing, Jeffrey made the statement that in 1992, while in prison, he married Katherine Johnson, and they had a kid together. Yeah, Katherine, a lady who knows what this man is capable of, married a man after he's been convicted of murder, sitting on death row, and had a kid with him. Sounds like love there. On October 24th of 2006, Jeffrey Lundgren died by lethal injection. It is said that nobody claimed his body and that he is buried in the prison cemetery. Jeffrey Lundgren died believing everything that he preached. He believed that he could talk to God. Even while he was in prison, he had his father. Like I said, he got married to Katherine Johnson while in prison. I'm going to say this for all those who need to hear it. If somebody comes up to you and proclaims that they are a prophet of God, if that person murders 5 people or even 1, they might not be a prophet of God. If you want to hear more details about Jeffrey Lundgren and his followers, please go to Spotify, Apple, Google, iHeartRadio, or wherever you get your podcasts and check out Murderers in Ohio. I am Bill Swafford, and this has been Murderers in Ohio.
We got the devil on the run in Ohio.